They called it a place that had no name on any map, a stretch of earth hidden among the cypress and the cotton fields, a place that people only spoke of in whispers when the fire burned low at night. The Death Farm, they called it, though the word was always half swallowed, as though even the name itself might summon something dreadful. Travelers passing along the Mississippi roads of 1823 would quicken their horses when they neared its borders. Some would even go miles out of their way, preferring hunger, rain, and exhaustion to brushing against the air that hung around that cursed land. They said the soil was strange there, darker than any other, damp even in the hottest summers, and when storms rolled across the hills, steam would rise from the furrows like breath from a wound. Old men swore the fields reeked of iron and rot, not of earth. And some who had once glimpsed it from a distance swore they saw shapes in the smoke at dusk, thin figures swaying in the fields long after the sun was gone. The Death Farm was not spoken of in the town ledgers or the county books. No preacher in Mississippi dared ride there, though many prayed against it. And yet it existed. Its master's money flowed into the markets, into the hands of officials, into the ledgers of merchants. Its cotton was sold, its profits spent, but the place itself remained wrapped in silence, as if paper and ink refused to admit what the land had become. For those who had worked its soil, for those who had once been trapped within its fences, the name was not folklore. It was memory carved into scar and bone. Those who escaped never returned. They lived like ghosts, silent, avoiding questions. When pressed, they would only whisper that some fates were worse than death itself. There were tales that the ground groaned at night, as if it remembered, that the trees surrounding the fields bent strangely, leaning not toward the sun, but away from the farm itself. Children in nearby villages dared each other to walk to the edge of its fences, but none ever lasted more than a few breaths before running back, pale-faced, certain they had heard something shift in the stillness, the scrape of a chain, the faint hiss of steam, or worse, the echo of a scream that no wind should carry. But what made the farm truly feared was not only the silence that surrounded it, but the scent that lingered on the wind, a smell that no storm could wash away. Farmers riding past with wagons of goods would pause, sniff the air, and curse under their breath, for they knew what it was. Not smoke, not waste, not the stink of swamp or marsh. It was the unmistakable stench of boiled flesh, faint but lingering, woven into the very air. It clung to the ground, to the stalks, even to the clouds above. No fire, no rain, no passage of time erased it. The people called it a curse. Some said it had always been that way, long before the white man came, that the land was poisoned, cursed by ancient blood. Others whispered it was not the land, but the man who ruled it, whose cruelty burned so deep into the soil that it would never let go. Whichever tale was true, one thing was certain. To step onto that land was to step into something that would cling to you long after you left. And so the Death Farm lived on in whispers, in warnings passed along dusty roads, in prayers muttered before sleep. It was a place that was never written, never marked, yet always present in the minds of those who lived near it. Because everyone knew that in Mississippi, in the year 1823, there was one plantation unlike any other, a place where death itself had been bound to the fields, and where the living walked already half consumed by its hunger. They said those who entered rarely left, and if they did, they never spoke again. Nathaniel Crow was a man whose wealth clung to him like perfume, but whose soul stank of rot. In town, he walked in polished boots, his coat pressed, his words dripping with the charm of a Southern gentleman. He smiled when he shook hands, tipped his hat to ladies, and carried himself as though he belonged in the company of senators and governors. But the moment he returned to the farm, the mask fell, and what remained was a creature whose hunger for domination was never satisfied. They said he had been born into privilege, but privilege was never enough. Crow wanted fear. He wanted obedience that lived not only in muscle but in the marrow. He saw men not as men but as tools, as cattle, as shadows that existed only to bend to his command. Whips and chains he considered too ordinary, too merciful. For those who faltered in his fields, he had devised punishments so unnatural that even the cruelest overseers whispered against them. At the far edge of the property stood a great iron vat, blackened with use, perched over a brick hearth that was never allowed to cool. It was large enough to swallow a manhole. Into it, water and lye were poured, heated until the air shimmered and the smell of burning seeped into every corner of the farm. Nathaniel's voice would ring across the yard when the vat was filled, calling all the enslaved to gather. And there, with his eyes shining as though it were theater, he would make examples. A man who slowed in the fields. A woman who dared to look him in the eye. A boy who prayed too loudly. One by one, they were dragged, screaming, to the vat. Crow never soiled his own hands. He ordered others to lower the victims, their bodies thrashing, the sound of flesh meeting boiling water tearing into the night. The screams would rise, then break, then fade into a silence that felt worse than the noise. He called it justice. He called it cleansing. But the people of the farm knew it for what it was, ritual. A cruelty repeated so often that it became the very rhythm of their days. They woke to the sound of crackling fires under the vat. They worked with the smell of steam drifting through the air. They slept with nightmares that were not imagination, but memory. There were times when the overseers themselves flinched, turning their faces away. Yet none dared stop him. Crow's money paid their wages, his rage filled their nights. And so the vat continued, swallowing bodies, swallowing voices, until the farm itself seemed to breathe in the suffering, exhale it back into the soil. The death farm did not earn its name from rumor. It was not the invention of fearful minds or the exaggeration of old women. It was carved into the very practice of the place, into the brick and iron, into the air that never lost the echo of screams. Children born on the farm grew up knowing that the vat was waiting for them. Their first lullabies mixed with the hiss of steam, their first steps taken in shadows cast by fire. Crow relished their terror. He wanted no hope, no spark of resistance. He wanted his enslaved to live already half dead, broken long before the vat claimed them. And for a time, he succeeded. Silence grew thick over the fields, obedience stitched into every movement. But cruelty has a way of rotting even its master. Each scream was a seed, buried in the dark earth, waiting for the season when the ground itself would no longer hold back what had been planted. And though Nathaniel Crow did not know it, every time the vat boiled, every time the air carried the stench of flesh, something unseen was gathering. A storm, patient as silence, waiting for its moment to strike. They moved like shadows across the fields, bent low beneath the sun, their bodies stitched with scars that told stories no words dared carry. The overseers barked, the whips cracked, and yet the strangest sound on the death farm was not violence. It was silence. A silence so thick it seemed to weigh upon the chest, pressing down until breath itself became a quiet rebellion. The enslaved spoke little, not because they had no words, but because words had betrayed too many before them. A careless whisper, a murmur of hope, could reach the wrong ear, and punishment would come swift as lightning. So they spoke only in prayers murmured under breath, in songs hummed without words, in a language of glances that flickered for a heartbeat before being buried under lowered eyes. Among them was a woman they called Eden. She was not old, yet sorrow had etched lines into her face deeper than age could. Once she had been taken from another farm, bought and sold like cattle, carried into this place of smoke and iron. But unlike many, something within her still resisted the silence. At dusk, when the overseers withdrew and the children huddled together in the cabins, Eden would hum, just a thread of sound, soft and trembling, almost lost beneath the crackle of the hearth. Her lullabies were old spirituals, fragments of songs remembered from those who came before. She sang not of freedom in words that could betray her, but of rivers, of birds, of stars that could not be chained. The children leaned into her voice as if it were the last fragile shelter left in the world. Their eyes closed, their breathing softened, and for a fleeting moment, the weight of the death farm loosened its grip. It was dangerous what she did. More than once, she caught the overseer's eye lingering on her when the humming slipped too close to audibility. But still she hummed, because to stop was to admit that Nathaniel Crow had burned every last ember of humanity from them. And as long as her voice lingered in the dark, there remained a spark, faint but unyielding. The others drew strength from her silence, too, a hand briefly brushing another while passing water. A scrap of food shared under the cover of shadows. Eyes meeting, even if only for an instant, carrying the message that they still saw one another, still existed as more than tools. In a place designed to erase them, every gesture was resistance. At night, the cabins groaned under the weight of despair. Men lay awake staring at the ceiling, hearing in their dreams the hiss of boiling water, the echo of screams that had been silenced. Children whimpered in their sleep, clutching each other as though they might vanish come morning. Mothers turned their faces to the wall, hiding tears that could bring punishment if seen. Yet even in that darkness, Eden's hum carried through, a thread of sound that seemed to stitch the broken pieces of their humanity together, however briefly. Some nights, when a moonlight cut through the cracks of the cabin walls, the sound rose faintly, weaving into the silence, daring to exist where nothing soft should survive. Still, beneath that fragile kindness lay an unspoken truth. Every soul on the death farm knew that kindness could not last forever. The silence was not peace. It was the breath held before a scream. The children who leaned into Eden's voice would one day be dragged toward the vats if they faltered. The men who pressed shoulders together in solidarity would one day be forced to watch each other burn. The silence was not emptiness, it was pressure. And like all pressure, it waited for the moment it would break. And in the hush of the cabins, where lullabies mingled with the memory of screams, there was a sense that something unseen was already stirring, shifting just beyond sight, like the tremor before a storm. The boy could not have been more than 15. His frame was wiry, his hands blistered from the rows of cotton, but his eyes carried something the others had long buried, the hunger to run. For weeks he had watched the tree lean at the far edge of the fields, memorizing the shadows, the dips in the land, the way the swamps swallowed sound. He whispered nothing, trusted no one, yet his every movement carried the fever of someone who dreamed beyond the fences. On a night when the moon was veiled in cloud, he tried. Barefoot, his breath sharp in his chest, he slipped from the cabin, hugging the dark like a second skin. The ground was damp beneath him, the cicadas loud enough to mask his steps. Each heartbeat was a drum, each rustle of grass a prayer. Freedom was only a few hundred yards away, but freedom on the death farm was a cruel dream. He had not made it to the tree lean when the dogs bayed. Torches flared, voices shouted, and the stillness of night shattered like glass. The boy ran, desperate, his body a blur against the fields. But he did not stand a chance. The hounds closed in, teeth snapping at his heels, and the overseers dragged him screaming back to the yard before dawn. Nathaniel Crow was waiting, his coat still buttoned, as though he had dressed for an occasion, his lips curled into something like amusement. He ordered every man, woman, and child dragged from the cabins, lined up beneath the watchful glow of the iron vat. The fire had already been stoked, the water bubbling, the air thick with steam. The boy thrashed, begged, screamed for his mother, but his cries only seemed to please Crow. With a voice that carried across the yard, he declared that disobedience would be burned from their bones, that none among them should dare dream of leaving his farm. His words rolled like scripture, a perverse sermon beneath the rising sun. And then, before the eyes of everyone who lived under his rule, he gave the command. The boy was lowered into the vat, his body writhing, the steam exploding upward as flesh met the boiling lye. The sound tore through the yard, a sound too terrible to be forgotten. Some covered their faces, others turned away, but none could shut out the noise. When silence came, it was worse. The boy's absence hung heavier than his screams, a hollow carved into the hearts of those who had known him. But alongside grief came something else, suspicion. Because whispers spread, quick as wildfire, someone must have told Crow. Someone must have known the boy's plan. He had trusted someone, and that trust had led him to the vat. Eyes began to narrow. Shoulders that once brushed in quiet solidarity stiffened, withdrew. The fragile threads that had bound them together now frayed, unraveling under the weight of doubt. Who had spoken? Who had betrayed them? No one asked aloud, for fear of the lash, but in the cabins, in the shadows, the silence changed. It no longer carried only fear of Crow. It carried mistrust of one another. Eden felt it most of all. The children who once leaned against her side now pulled back, wondering if she, too, might carry secrets. When she hummed, fewer voices dared to echo. She felt their gazes heavy on her, not with love, but with suspicion. The betrayal had seeped into the air, poisoning what little unity had survived. Nathaniel Crow knew this. He stood at his balcony that night, watching the cabins, his lips curving in satisfaction. Fear alone could break bodies, but suspicion broke souls. He had not only taken the boy's life, he had taken their trust in each other, leaving them isolated, caged not by iron but by doubt. And yet, beneath that sickness, something else stirred. Because even betrayal cannot smother the memory of a scream that burns the sky. The boy's cries haunted them, echoing in their dreams, pushing against the silence with a weight that grew heavier with every passing night. The boy was gone, but the sound of him remained. And though suspicions spread like rot, something else, darker, sharper, began to take root in its shadow. The nights grew heavier after the boy's death, each hour stretched thin by the echo of his screams. The cabins felt smaller, the walls closer, as if the wood itself held the memory of what they had seen. No one spoke of him, yet he lived in every silence, in every glance cast sideways, in every pause before a word was dared. Suspicion lingered like smoke that would not clear, thickening the air until even kindness felt dangerous. Eden carried the weight of it in her chest. She no longer hummed as freely. Her voice, once a thread of comfort, now trembled with unease. When she closed her eyes at night, she saw visions, fire crawling across the fields like a living thing, chains snapping like brittle branches, a river of flame where rows of cotton once stood. In her dreams, the vats cracked open, spilling not water but blood, steaming into the sky until the air itself turned red. She woke gasping, sweat-soaked, her heart racing as though the vision had burned her from within. Others began to feel it too, though they spoke no words. The air grew tense, brittle as glass. A single wrong step, a single whisper could shatter it. The overseers noticed. They watched closer, their dogs prowling the cabins at night, their whips cutting deeper at the smallest hesitation. Nathaniel Crow, sensing the shift, descended into paranoia. He stalked the farm like a predator, his eyes sharp, his voice crueler than before. He punished at random, striking even those who had done nothing, as though to remind them that despair itself was his weapon. Yet cruelty, repeated too often, carries its own poison. Each act of punishment was another coal laid upon the fire beneath their silence. Fear no longer bowed their heads. It hardened their gazes, turned their grief into something sharper. The children, once cowed into trembling obedience, began to cling tighter to one another, their small hands gripping like roots clinging to soil. The men, once silent in the fields, began to lift their eyes, however briefly, to meet across the rows. Even in suspicion, a deeper bond was forming, not of trust, but of shared torment. Eden felt it in her bones, a rhythm pulsing beneath the silence. The lullabies returned, softer but steadier, humming against the darkness as if to stitch the cracks that betrayal had opened. And the people listened again, though their faces were drawn tight with sorrow. Her voice carried not only comfort, but warning that silence could not hold forever, that the earth itself was preparing to break. Storm clouds gathered in the distance, heavy with rain that refused to fall. Days blurred into one another, the sky dim with dust and smoke from the endless fires that fed the vats. At night, thunder rumbled far away, too distant to cool the air, yet close enough to vibrate through the ground like a drumbeat. To the enslaved, it sounded like an omen, a voice calling from beyond the horizon. Even Nathaniel could not escape the shift. He paced the veranda, his boots striking the wood like gunshots, his glass of whiskey trembling in his hand. He snapped at overseers, raged at the smallest error, his eyes darting to shadows as though expecting them to rise against him. The more he struck, the more he sensed their quiet defiance. The more he punished, the more he felt their eyes burning into him, not with fear, but with something colder. It was coming. Everyone felt it. The air was thick, electric, carrying a charge that had no release. Even the animals grew restless, the horses stamping, the dogs howling at nothing in the dark. The land itself seemed to strain beneath the weight of what it carried. And in the cabins, when the overseers were gone, when the children lay half asleep, Eden whispered into the silence words she had never spoken before. Words not of prayer, but of promise. That the fire in her dreams was not only destruction, it was deliverance. That chains, no matter how heavy, could break if enough hands pulled against them. Her words were dangerous, more dangerous than the boy's attempt to flee. Yet they rooted themselves in the hearts of those who heard, quiet but unshakable. The storm was gathering. It did not roar yet, but pressed against the horizon, waiting. And when it broke, it would drench the death farm in more than rain. The night was moonless, the kind of darkness that swallows even the shape of trees. The air was thick and damp, heavy with a heat that refused to lift, as though the earth itself was holding its breath. In the cabins, men and women lay awake, their eyes open, their hands clenched, listening to the silence. Somewhere in that silence, a decision had been made, not in words, not in whispers, but in the heavy thrum of blood, in the shared glances that had passed in the fields, in the visions that haunted Eden's dreams. The fire beneath the vats still smoldered, its orange glow flickering across the yard. Nathaniel Crow slept above it all, drunk on whiskey and arrogance, certain that his cruelty was enough to keep rebellion chained. But cruelty, repeated too long, had become its own kind of fuel, and tonight that fuel would burn. It began with a spark, a barn set aflame, its dry timbers catching like tinder, flames clawing upward into the night sky. The blaze lit the fields in violent hues of red and gold, shadows leaping like specters across the cotton rows. The overseers shouted, their voices sharp with panic, dogs baying at the fire, the order of the death farm unraveling in an instant. From the cabins, the enslaved poured forth, not with weapons of steel, but with tools of the fields, scythes, hoes, stones clenched in desperate fists. Their voices rose not in song, not in prayer, but in a guttural cry that tore through the silence of years. Chains clattered against the ground as men ripped free the iron that bound them. Women lifted torches, their flames reflected in eyes that no longer looked down. Children clung to their elders, silent witnesses to the storm breaking at last. The overseers tried to rally. Whips cracked, pistols fired, dogs lunged. But rage, once unleashed, is stronger than any chain. The enslaved surged forward, their fury a tide that drowned fear itself. A man seized the whip from his overseer's hand and lashed it back against him. A woman hurled a stone that shattered bone. Blood mixed with fire, screams with smoke. The night transformed into a reckoning long foretold. And in the chaos, Nathaniel Crow appeared. His face pale in the firelight, blade drawn, his voice snarling commands that no one heeded. He swung like a beast cornered, his knife slicing, his fury wild. For a moment, he cut down those who came near, his strength fed by desperation. But numbers closed in around him, hands seizing his arms, his coat, dragging him down from the veranda into the dirt. His boots struck, his voice roared, but the tide did not loosen. They dragged him toward the vat, the same vat into which he had ordered countless souls lowered, the iron glowing faintly in the fire's reflection, the water within steaming, alive with heat. Crow thrashed, his knife clattering away, his polished boots slipping in the mud. For the first time, his cries carried not command but terror. He begged, cursed, threatened, pleaded, but his words fell like ash, meaningless against the roar of vengeance around him. Eden stood among them, torchlight dancing across her face. Her lullabies had been prayers once, but tonight her silence was harder, sharper. She watched as Nathaniel was forced to the vat's edge, his body bent backward, steam rising to meet him like a hungry spirit. And then, with a force born of every scar, every tear, every scream that had risen into the night, he was thrust into the boiling water. The hiss tore through the air, louder than any scream. His voice shrieked, high and ragged, echoing the cries he had once silenced. The steam rose thick, enveloping him, enveloping them all, until the night itself seemed to vanish in the cloud. His body thrashed, then weakened, then fell still, his screams dissolving into a silence more terrible than noise. Around them, the farm burned. Barns collapsed, fences crackled, cotton fields glowed red with embers. Dogs fled into the night. Overseers lay fallen in blood and ash. The death farm, for so long a place of silence and cruelty, roared with fire and vengeance, its name carved into the very sky by smoke. And as the flames rose higher, steam curling from the vat, the enslaved knew that nothing, not prayer, not punishment, not even memory, would erase this night. The death farm was undone, but not ended. For fire leaves ashes, and ashes always whisper. Dawn crept slowly over the smoldering ruin, pale light spilling across fields where no birds sang. Smoke still curled from the earth in thin, ghostly strands, rising from blackened barns and charred fences. The cotton rows were gone, swallowed by flame, leaving only a skeleton of stalks brittle as bone. The death farm had burned, but in the quiet aftermath, the land itself seemed reluctant to breathe again. Bodies lay scattered. Some overseers collapsed with pistols in their hands. Others trampled in the rush of fury. The dogs that had once prowled the fields were silent now, their chains lying twisted in the ash. The vats stood like monuments, their rims blackened, their steam spent, as if the earth had finally consumed the hunger within them. The enslaved survivors moved like shadows in the morning light, their eyes hollow, their voices hushed. They carried little, a ragged cloth, a tin cup, a bundle of food scavenged from the kitchen. Their bodies bore the marks of the night's violence, but their silence carried something heavier. Freedom had no celebration here, no songs of triumph. Freedom was flight, fragile and unfinished, chased by the fear that every snapping twig in the woods would be the crack of a whip. Eden walked among them, a child on her hip, another clinging to her skirt. In her hand, she held a Bible half-burnt, its leather scorched, its pages singed at the edges. She had pulled it from the ashes of the master's house, not for the words it held, but for what it represented. A relic of fire, a reminder that even the tools of the master could not fully burn away. Her face was drawn, her eyes unblinking, as if she carried every scream of the night behind them. Some turned toward the swamps, their feet sinking into mud as the cypress trees swallowed them whole. Others slipped into the forests, guided by instinct more than direction. They scattered like seeds in the wind, each carrying the memory of fire, each uncertain whether the world beyond the farm would welcome or destroy them. They had no maps, no safe roads, only the knowledge that remaining meant certain death. Behind them, the death farm smoldered, its ruins already twisting into legend. The air seemed heavy, as though saturated with the steam of the past. Travelers would not come this way for months, perhaps years, but when they did, they would see the scorched soil, the collapsed barns, the vats rusting in silence. And some would swear that the ground still breathed, that the smoke never truly cleared. Rumors would grow from that silence. Some would say the slaves who burned the farm were cursed, wandering spirits who never reached freedom. Others would whisper that Nathaniel Crow himself haunted the land, his body forever boiling, his screams woven into the hiss of rain when it struck the blackened earth. Mothers would hush their children with tales of the death farm, warning them never to walk too close, never to listen too long. Eden did not look back as she entered the trees. Her steps were steady, her shoulders bearing the weight of survival. Around her, the children clung tighter, their small hands gripping her like roots seeking soil. She whispered nothing, Not lullabies, not prayers. The time for song had passed. All that remained was the sound of footsteps fading into the wilderness, the hush of leaves closing behind them. By the time the sun lifted higher, the farm was empty. Only the wind moved through the ruins, carrying with it the scent of ash and iron. The fire had ended, but the silence it left was heavier, more enduring. It was not the silence of peace, but of memory, a silence that pressed itself into the soil, into the bones buried beneath it, into the air that refused to clear. And in that silence, the death farm did not die. It waited. Years passed, and the land where the death farm once stood grew wild again. Weeds crept through the blackened fields, twisting around the rusted iron of the vats. Vultures circled in the sky, drifting on air that still shimmered as though touched by unseen heat. Travelers along the old road gave the place wide berth. Eyes averted, spurs quickened, as if proximity alone might brand them with its curse. The farm no longer belonged to the living. It belonged to whispers. They said that after heavy rains, the ground still steamed, as though the soil itself remembered the boiling water that had once consumed flesh. The air would carry a stench not of wet earth, but of something acrid, sharp, and unnatural. Hunters swore that no animal grazed near the ruins, not even the wild dogs or scavenging crows. The place was barren, sterile, as though the earth had sealed itself against rebirth. Stories grew, as stories always do. Some claimed to see pale figures moving in the fields at dusk, their heads bowed, their hands bound in invisible chains. Others spoke of voices, cries carried on the night wind, rising and falling like the sound of steam hissing from a kettle. A few said they had glimpsed a man standing beside the vats, his skin blistered, his eyes hollow, his mouth frozen in an endless scream. Nathaniel Crow, they whispered, had not been granted death. His body might have burned, but his cruelty lingered, echoing through the ruin like a sermon without end. The townsfolk gave the place a name that outlived him, the Death Farm. Children were warned never to wander near it. Drifters spoke of it in saloons, their words slurred but their eyes sharp with unease. Preachers condemned it from the pulpit, pointing to it as proof that hell was not only beneath the earth but could be found on it. Even those who did not believe in ghosts could not deny that the land had grown twisted, poisoned by what it had witnessed. History, in its way, forgot. The records of plantations listed acres and yields, but left no trace of screams. No ledger spoke of the vats. No census marked the names of those consumed by boiling water. The world moved on, building new farms, new wars, new stories. But folklore does not need parchment to endure. Folklore survives in silence, in unease, in the way a traveler quickens their horse at dusk when the wind shifts. And so the death farm remained, not as a line in history, but as a wound in memory. Parents frightened their children with tales of its curse. Old men spat tobacco and swore they had seen shadows moving where no shadows should be. On summer nights, when thunder rolled low and heavy, some swore the sound was not the storm, but the echo of vats boiling again. Eden's name, too, drifted into legend. Some said she led her people north to freedom. Others claimed she vanished in the swamps, her lullabies forever carried in the reeds. A few even whispered she returned in secret, walking the ruins barefoot at night, clutching her scorched Bible, keeping vigil for the souls that never escaped. Whether she lived or perished, her voice lingered, fragile, unbroken, carried in the imagination of those who longed for something more than silence. No fence was ever rebuilt on that ground. No plow turned its soil again. Men who tried claimed their horses balked, their tools rusted, their nights filled with dreams of fire and screaming. The death farm had chosen its own fate, and it was not to be reclaimed. And so it stands, not in books, not in monuments, but in whispers, a farm where men and women were scalded alive, where cruelty boiled itself into the land, where silence became heavier than stone. They say if you walk too close on a moonless night, you will feel the heat on your skin, rising from the earth itself. They say the screams will catch in your throat before you can speak. And the old ones will tell you this. Some places never die. They wait, and they whisper,